We'll have you this morning turn one last time to the book of James. We're in the last verse of chapter 1, which we said chapter 1, he kind of gives all the introductory material to his letter and then kind of dives into each topic in different ways throughout the rest of his letter. So we're in that last verse, James 1:27. And we started this last week. We started into this verse last week, looked at the latter half of this, and this morning we'll look at the former half. But if you're there in James 1:27, let's read that together as it introduces our topic for this morning, which actually becomes kind of a springboard for our Christmas season. So it says there, "Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world." So last week, like I said, we looked at the latter half of this, right? There's two parts to this pure and undefiled religion, which is really the aim of James's letter here, that he wants all Christians to grow up and mature in their faith to this point, to reflect this pure and undefiled religion. And so last week we looked at what it means to keep oneself unstained by the world. So that's half of what it means, a part of what it means to have this pure and undefiled religion. To keep oneself unstained by the world, we said we have to be humble before God for that, and then we also have to draw near to Him. Kind of the flip side of the same coin, that we're submitted to Him and humbled before Him, but we're continually drawing closer to Him in His presence. And so that's part of what it means to keep oneself unstained by the world. But this week we'll look at the former half of this equation. What he says there, to visit orphans and widows in their distress. To visit orphans and widows in their distress, and more generally speaking, as he develops this further through his letter, we'll see that he's talking more generally about helping other people who are in need, right? And he happens to highlight widows and orphans, some of the most vulnerable in their society and place. But how many of us want to, especially as we're going into the Christmas season, want to be the kind of people who are, first of all, able, but then also willing to help other people who are in need, right? And I'm not just talking about, right, throwing money at a situation, but to really know what a person needs, to be able to see that and to be able to address it, to legitimately help them in their place and time of need. And so, like I said, James develops this further as he goes through his letter, as we'll see in chapter 2, verses 1 through 17. We'll look at those together. And then he actually concludes his letter in chapter 5, verses 19 and 20, with this same topic of helping other people. And I think it's important to point out here that after James gets through the introductory material, right, he kind of hits all the topics in chapter 1. He starts out in chapter 2 with this topic of helping other people, and then he concludes his letter. So really the beginning and end of the meat of his letter is on this topic of helping, legitimately, genuinely helping other people. And I think, as we'll see this morning, something else that's interesting here to note is that from the time that James introduces this in chapter 1 until he concludes his letter, there are some steps that he kind of lays out for us that help us to know how to legitimately meet other people's needs, right? He's not just prescribing this is what you have to do in this particular situation. He's giving us principles that help us to analyze how we meet needs in every circumstance that we find ourselves, in every situation where we see needs. So this morning we'll look at that. We'll look at these 4 steps, really, that James encourages believers to take in order to genuinely help other people. So the first step that he gives us, and right here in chapter 1, verse 27, is this word to visit. To visit orphans and widows in their distress. The word visit here is interesting to me because it's also translated care for in other translations, or look after these widows and orphans in their distress. The Greek word, though, is episkeptomai. Episkeptomai, it's a two-part word. Epa, which means upon or for, but skeptomai is a word that means to watch or to look, not just like a passing glance, but an intense look at something. So the Strong's Concordance defines it this way: episkeptomai, to look upon or after, to examine, to inspect with the eyes. And in every occurrence of the word in the New Testament, it's implied that we're doing this, that we're looking upon these scenarios in order to find ways that we can benefit other people. That's how it's used throughout the New Testament. But it begins with really looking, opening our eyes, doesn't it? Showing up and looking at those problems. It's interesting that in this introductory statement, right, James doesn't, as we said before, James doesn't prescribe a specific way to help these orphans and widows, right? He could have said that pure and undefiled religion is to financially support orphans and widows. Or he could have said to take in these orphans and widows, or to vie for political or government help for these orphans and widows, right? He could have said any number of very specific things, and those may very well be the result of what James is teaching through his letter, part of the equation. But James starts with this word to visit, to look upon and look out for these orphans and widows. I think that's a good point for us this morning, to think through that the first step to genuinely helping someone is to show up, right? To look into their situation, take time, spend time with those individuals, and keep our eyes open to the struggles that they're facing in life. To keep our eyes open to the struggles that they're facing, and only then can we really begin to help. But that's a challenging step for us, I think, isn't it? Especially when we look at all the things that we've got to do, all the challenges that we're facing, or the schedules that are packed tight, especially this time of year. It's challenging to think that we have a time to spend to look into the struggles that other people are facing, right? To really show up in their life and be present. It was a couple weeks ago, Dave Phillips was sharing with me. How many of you remember John Mahanji? He came here to church. It's been, I guess, a couple years ago, and spoke with us. He's the director of African Ministries, and we coordinate with him a lot of our missions work in Africa. And recently, he said something, and Dave Phillips shared this with me. It was something that challenged me. He said of the American church, conservatives send money to missions, and liberals send people. And to be honest, I really wrestled with that for multiple reasons. One, because really the sending of both resources and people into mission work ought to be a nonpartisan issue, right? For any Christian, and across the board, Christians should look different than the rest of their political party, shouldn't they? We don't necessarily line up perfectly with all the stances of our political party. A a conservative Christian ought to be one that's willing to go and be present in those places, as well as sending the finances, right? And same on the reverse side. If somebody says that they're a Christian and they are a liberal, then they're a person that needs to be able to work hard to send resources, and not just to go over into those places. But the second thing that really I struggled with what he said is that while money is extremely necessary in those ministries and things happening in Africa, what is theology transferred through? How do people know who God is? How do people grow in their knowledge of who He is? And I think it's people, right? It's relationships with people. And so I believe that's what James is getting at here with this word to visit orphans and widows in their distress. It goes beyond just saying, well, they have a need over there, we're going to send something to them, without going and being physically present in that place. Amen? There's something to being able to effectively disciple and lead people to Christ in going and being present in those places. Amen? Right? If we're just sending resources and money over to Africa, we're not conveying the gospel that we can if we go. Right? I mean, the Christmas season is all about Jesus coming to earth. Right? He could have sent hundreds, thousands, millions of angels to come and do all of these things and ministries and help us. But what He gave was Himself. Right? He visited us. And He was present with us. Got familiar with our sufferings and our struggles. And so that's the first thing that James is saying. If we're going to legitimately be able to help people, the first step in that process is to visit them, to be present in those places, to begin to know and understand the needs and struggles that they're in. Man, that does mean that our hands get messy probably in the process, doesn't it? You think of the many needs in our community, and that's a challenging task, isn't it? To step into some of those things. But we can't just put our blinders on and keep marching forward. We have to open our eyes and see those things and really get in it and bring Christ into that scenario. So the first step of that process of helping people is to visit them, to be present in those places, to open our eyes, to look intently upon. The second thing, and we'll read this in chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, the second step in this process that we'll see is that we need to be impartial. Impartial. Let's look and see what he has to say on this. Chapter 2, he says, right after the end of 21, or after the end of chapter 1, he says, "My beloved brethren, do not behold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring, dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who is wearing the fine clothes and say, 'You sit here in a good place,' and you say to the poor man, 'You stand over there or sit down at my footstool,' have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which He promised to those who love Him? But you, having dishonored the poor man, is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court? Do they not blaspheme the fair name by which you have been called? If, however, you are fully fulfilling the royal law according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as a transgressor. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point has become guilty of all. For he who said, 'Do not commit adultery,' also said, do not commit murder. If you do not commit adultery but commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be merciless to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy, he says, triumphs over judgment. So James starts this section out with this description of two people entering your church service, essentially, is what he's talking about. Entering your meeting for worship, and one is dressed in fine clothes, looks well off, and the other one is, right, not so much. And he challenges them and encourages them not to be partial towards the one just because he looks like he's better off than the other one. Right? Not to show favoritism in that place, to be impartial. And to be honest, as I read through this, my initial thought is, well, that's terrible. I think it's easy for us to read that and think, well, what a terrible thing to do as a church. That should never be the case. And I do pray and hope that that's not the case here. I don't think that I've ever seen that. So I'm thankful for that. But I think that we have to let this message sink down, really down into our souls, right? Let it sink a little bit deeper than just thinking about if somebody walks into our church service. And we ask ourselves, are there people, are there places or circumstances in which upon first introduction to a person, we have an attitude of favoritism, some personal bias for or against someone, just based on a initial introduction? Are there places in our life where that's true? And I think, if we're honest, that there are a lot of places like that. That in our own hearts where we jump to a quick initial judgment of a person based on outward things. But I think that we should constantly, what James is encouraging us here, is constantly be striving to give every single person we meet and encounter in this world, to give them a fair shot to prove themselves to us over time. Right? Not to just jump to conclusions and say this person's this way or that, but to be open to letting them prove themselves out over time. And so after James gives us this initial scenario of the two people entering the service, James gives 4 reasons why we should be impartial. And just quickly roll down through these. In verses 5 through 6, he encourages us to see that God chose the poor to be rich in faith. I think of what Jesus said at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I think, to be honest, those who are financially poor, like James is talking about here, they're often in a closer position to be poor in spirit than the rich of the world, aren't they? Now, every one of us, we have to be poor in spirit to enter his kingdom. That's the first step, to be humbled before him. But there's a certain extent to which financial poverty puts you in a place to be a little bit more poor in spirit, right? To realize that you have a need. I heard at some point on Moody Radio they were talking about people who are financially poor, not well off, or in countries that are not well off. They have an easier time grasping the fact that they are sinners and that they need a Savior. They need help out of their circumstances. And so James is pointing that out here, that God has chosen the poor to be rich in faith. Now that doesn't always equate, right? The rich can be humble too before him, and the poor can certainly be hardened against him. But James is encouraging us to see that. The second thing he says here, and this is a particular scenario that's applied to their circumstances, he says that the rich were the ones who were oppressing the church. We said from the beginning that if they were a church who was being persecuted, that was facing all kinds of challenges the church that James was writing to. And he said oftentimes it's the rich that's dragging them into court and doing these things, bringing them against them. Thirdly, he says, verses 8 through 12, that if they were obeying this, or a third reason that he gives for being impartial is that it would be breaking the royal law to love your neighbor as yourself. And so that if you were being impartial to other people, he says that essentially you're a sinner on all counts, right? So he calls this showing favoritism, he calls it a sin. And then the fourth reason that he gives for being impartial, in verse 13, he says that mercy triumphs over judgment. Mercy triumphs over judgment. We all know that there's an extent to which we are going to be judged by the same extent that we judge other people. I know that's going to be true in eternity, but I think it also applies to this life, right? If we're critical of other people, we're going to be more critical of ourselves. And if we're critical of other people, they're going to be more critical of us, right? If we're bringing mercy to a situation, then there'll be more mercy for us when we need it. How many of us need mercy? So those are the four things that James gives us. And I would add maybe to that list that God himself is impartial. We see that through Scripture. Peter, after receiving the vision of the unclean animals coming down in Joppa and going over and ministering to Cornelius, who was a Gentile, Peter finally, his eyes are open. He says, I most certainly understand now that God is not one to show partiality, but in every nation the man who fears him and does what is right is welcome to him. And then Paul in another place, Romans 2:11, simply says, there is no partiality with God. And so the more impartial we can be, the more we're reflecting the nature of the God that we're serving. All people are created in his image, amen? And yes, sin mars that image, but it's still there, it's still present for everyone who's breathing and walking in this world. And early Quakers I know used to not make distinctions between those of nobility and those who were poor, and all of their language, the ways that they talked, got them into a lot of trouble in some places. But I think that's an important distinctive as Christians that engage in this world, right? That we see all men as created equal before God, and we bring that message into the world that we live in. So the first step James gives us, right, is to show up, to be present, to visit, but then also in that place of visiting, we're not being partial to one or another. We're showing that all men are created equal in God's eyes, and all of us, right, have the same opportunity at the cross, right, to lay our own sins down and to accept his grace. So those are the first two steps. The third, and this is probably what we typically think of when we think of helping other people, is in verses 14 through 17. He continues right after talking about not showing partiality. These were verses actually we read a few weeks ago when we talked about putting our faith into action. But there's definitely a crossover to what we're talking about this morning. Verse 14, he says, what use is it, brethren, if someone says he has faith but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. The third step in this process, after we've visited, gotten to know the needs, and we're being impartial in that process, the third step is to actually serve, put our faith into action, right? Put our faith into action. I think James realizes that visiting and being impartial to needy strangers is is a prerequisite to this step. I often hear people conflicted, as we mentioned earlier, about giving money to somebody that they're passing on the street, right? It's a challenging circumstance. You've been there, you're driving your car, and somebody has a sign out, and you think, man, I don't really know anything about this person's circumstance. They're asking for money, but what are they going to spend this on? Is this money actually going to be a help to them, or is it not, right? Because it could very well be going to something that's going to be destructive in their life. And so we kind of wrestle with that, and I'd encourage you in that place just to lean upon the leading of the Holy Spirit in that scenario. But what if you could, spend time with that person? Really get to know what their life is like, what their real needs are. It'd be a lot easier to be able to genuinely help them in that place, isn't it? And notice how James calls this person in verse 15. Right, he refers to the person that is asking for help. He says, if a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food. James is talking about someone who is close, someone that you would know the kinds of needs that are in their life. Right? Not just a complete stranger. So that's why the visiting and being impartial to strangers is a necessary part of legitimately helping someone, where they could be called then a brother or sister. Reach that point in your relationship. But I think once we've done those things, then that's the time for that faith to be put into action, right? Once we know the need, now God's laying it on us, if we have the ability to meet that need, right? To step into that scenario and to truly help another person in Jesus' name. To show up in their circumstances. So those are the first three steps: to visit, to be impartial, and to serve, to genuinely serve, meet those physical needs. But then the ultimate goal, we reach at the end of James's letter. And I think a lot of what James is writing in his book is leading us to this final conclusion that he gives us in chapter 5, verses 19 and 20. He says in those last verses, in our last step this morning, he says, "My brethren, if any among you strays from the truth, and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his ways will save his soul from death, and will cover a multitude of sins." In this statement, James reminds us what our chief problem is in this world, and what the ultimate solution to that problem is. The chief problem is sin, isn't it? Began with Adam and Eve in the garden, right? And it's infected the rest of humanity. The chief problem is sin, and the ultimate way that is addressed is turning a sinner, he says, from the error of their ways and leading them back to truth. To save his soul from death and cover over, as he says, a multitude of sins. So what is the truth this morning? What is the truth that he's talking about? Maybe a better question would be, who is the truth? Jesus Christ, right? John 14:6, he is the way and the truth and the life. It says, "And no one comes to the Father but by him." The ultimate way that we help a person, right, is pointing them to Jesus Christ, leading them into a deeper relationship with him, and thereby being reconciled to God the Father. And I think this is true in both evangelism and discipleship, isn't it? If there are believers that we are close to, right, that we've spent time visiting with, that we've been impartial to their circumstances, that we've been able to serve alongside of or in their life, and we know of things that are off in their life, then we are in a position, right, to lead them closer to who Jesus Christ is, right? Maybe be able to lovingly correct their steps, and that's James. The Bible refers to that as discipleship, right? To grow in our knowledge, in our walk with Jesus Christ, to walk more in tune with Him. And as Christians, we're called to come alongside other Christians and help them in that process. That's discipleship. And we're also to do that for people who are unbelievers, right? That takes even more time visiting and being impartial, right? There are plenty of things in this world that we'd rather, right, keep our hands clean of. But God calls us in those places to engage, to show up, be impartial, and to serve their physical needs, so that it gives us an opportunity, amen? An opportunity to share Christ into that circumstance, such that they would be turned back to the truth, turned back from the error of their ways, and come and walk in a reconciled relationship with God, to become believers and start that discipleship process, amen? And so that's the ultimate way that we help other people, but man, there are steps before we get to that point, right? I mean, we can go out and have street evangelism, and there's places for that. Go knocking door to door and hand out tracts. But it's a whole lot more effective when we've invested in other people's lives, right? Where they see the love of God in us and through us. Gives us a little bit more of their ear to listen to the gospel that leads us to do those things. Amen? I think that's ultimately how we bring the kingdom of heaven here on earth as it is in heaven. Like Jesus taught us to pray. So as we close this morning, I'd encourage you to consider, who are the people? Who are the people in your own circle of influence right now in your life that God is calling you to help in this way? Who are the people God is calling you to help, to come alongside of? And then which of these steps is your next step, maybe happening this week, for helping them? Is it to visit them, to really get to know their circumstance? Is it to lay aside previous biases or favoritism? Is our next step maybe to serve them? Maybe we know of a specific need in their life that we can meet. Or is it time to share Christ with them? Whether they're Christian or non-Christian. Share with them what the Bible has to say and leading them in their next step. Would you pray with me this morning? Lord, we have been challenged by James all the way through as we've read. And now with this topic of helping other people, I think we are no less challenged, especially as we're heading into the Christmas season. I do pray that you would continue to lay upon our hearts the burden that was upon your own heart in sending your Son to this world. To first and foremost visit with us, to become familiar with our sufferings and our struggles. And we know the holiness, Lord, that you had to cling to even as you walked in this world, and to be impartial to our needs and our darkness. Pray, Lord, that you would help us to follow his example of serving in that place and shining his light, such that we could be salt and light in this world as you've called us to be. Father, we pray all these things in Jesus' powerful and precious name this morning. Amen. God bless you this week. We're dismissed.